éppen most kezdtem el a köszöntést, és azt elmesélni, hogy nagyon nagy öröm számunkra, hogy részt vesztek ezen a webináriumon. Szeretném nektek bemutatni Fischer Mártát és Trebits Annát, ő a két oktatónk. Mai estére ők azok, akik kidolgozták ezt az EU-English nevű képzést. Most őszintén remélem, hogy látjátok a megosztott képernyőben, most elmentem a Tempus Közalapítvány képzőközpontjának a honlapjára, és bocsánat, én saját magamat elfelejtettem bemutatni. Én Horváth Emőke vagyok, és ennek a Tempus Közalapítvány képzőközpontnak vagyok az egyik koordinátora, és mi szoktuk ezeket a képzéseket szervezni. Ez az EU-English Európai Uniós ismeretek angol nyelven, ez egy olyan képzés, amit, mint láthatjátok, Trebits Anna és Fischer Márta dolgoztak ki, úgyhogy ezért külön öröm számunkra, hogy ők tartják ezeket a webináriumokat, és az a célunk, hogy egy kicsit hallhassatok tőlük, meg lássátok, hogy mi is ez a EU-English, tegyetek fel nekik kérdéseket, és szeretnénk indítani még egy ilyen képzést jövő tavasszal, és fogtok majd kapni egy visszajelző kérdőívet, és arra mindenképpen benne lesz ez a kérdés, hogy érdekel-e benneteket tovább, meghallgatva ezt a webináriumot, ennek a témának a folytatása, illetve hogy eljönnétek egy ilyen képzésre. A következő oldal, amit szeretnénk megmutatni, ez nektek, ez az EU English on the Go, ez Mártéknak a saját honlapja, és ezt nagyon érdemes bogarászni, mert mindig valami érdekesség és újdonság van benne. Hallom, és valaki bepittyent, történt valami? Nem hallottam. Itt vagytok még? Ahó. Ja, meg vagytok? Jó. Oké, csak már hirtelen. Adrien. Ó, nem Adrien? Igen. Jó, még tényleg nem látok. Jó, hallotok. Jó, csak olyan hirtelen elcsendesült mindenki, azt hittem, hogy eltöntöttek. Jó, és akkor erről a honlapról biztos, hogy fognak Márték is említést tenni még a webinárium során, és mindent láthatjátok, van Facebookon is egy EU-English nevű oldal. Épp itt nézegettem ma, hogy én is szeretném majd megnézni, beírtatok egy ilyen challenge-et, amit az EU-English kapcsán ilyen phrasal verb-öket lehet megnézni, hogy ki mennyire ügyes és mennyire ismeri ezeket a dolgokat, úgyhogy abszolút hasznos és mindennapi információk vannak benne, és még egy oldalt szeretnék nektek megmutatni, ez pedig a Tempus Közalapítványnak az oktatás és képzés oldala, ez pedig a mi információs oldalunk, erre föl lehet iratkozni, és szintén rengeteg érdekes információt lehet találni a különböző képzéseinkről. Most, mint látjátok, éppen a digitális, de mi lesz ez, nagy konferencia előtt állunk, úgyhogy most tulajdonképpen minden hírünk ehhez kapcsolódik, de azért itt van az EU-Englishnek is ugye a kis ikonkája, tehát a webináriumot is híreltük ezen az oldalon. Na, úgyhogy talán ennyi lenne. Ja, és Márti kért még engem arra, hogy mutassak be nektek egy kiadványt, amit említeni fog a mai alkalmon. Ez a Somogyi Kereskedelmi és Iparkamarának az oldalán van rajta. Az a címe ennek a kiadványnak, hogy Európai Unió dióhéjban. És ez egy nagyon-nagyon jó kis kiadvány, a jó ebben a honlapban, hogy itt rá tudtok kattintani, és el tudjátok kezdeni lapozgatni, mintha tényleg egy kiadvány lenne, és ez is nagyon nagy segítséget nyújt majd abban a témában, amiket a mai napon érinteni fogunk. Jó, úgyhogy én akkor visszatérek most az oldalra, és akkor eddig én magyarul beszéltem, de át fogom adni a szót most a két oktatóknak, ők majd bemutatkoznak, egy picit fognak magukról is beszélni, és akkor elindítom azt az anyagot, amit ők készítettek ehhez a mai alkalomhoz. Úgyhogy remélem, hogy ezt is fogjátok látni. Nézd oda. Na.
Igen, lehet, hogy belevágnék közben.
Igen, elkezdtem.
Lenne még egy olyan kérdésem, esetleg, hogyha itt a résztvevők közben be tudnának írni, csak úgy kíváncsi vagyok, hogy ki az, aki már meghallgatta korábban. Húha, most valamiért nagyon rezonál a hangom, vagy nem tudom, szóval így teljesen visszhangzik, úgyhogy elnézést, mert ahogy én hallom magamat, hát ez nagyon
nem, teljesen jól
fog maradni. Lehet hallani? Jó, akkor nektek jó.
Igen, mi hallunk
jó,
téged.
Tehát én Trebits Anna vagyok, és akkor mindjárt át is váltok angolra, mint itt elindul a prezentáció. Tehát csak annyi lenne gyorsan a kérdésem, hogy van-e olyan köztetek, aki már hallotta az első vagy a második webináriumot esetleg?
Aha. Valaki nem.
Aha, jó, tehát van, aki igen, van, aki még nem. Jó, ezt csak előjáróban mondom, csak úgy általánosságban, hogy úgy csináltuk meg, hogy hát aki már hallotta, annak lesz, ami ugye ismétlődik, mert így a bevezetését egy kicsikét ugyanúgy csináljuk, hogy mégis mindenki számára úgy teljes legyen a kép, de aztán utána más példákat fogunk hozni, tehát mindenképpen újdonság is lesz az anyagban bőven. Okay, then I'll just switch to English, and while we're waiting for this material to appear, I'm just going to say a few words about myself. So I'm a lecturer and researcher in English as a second language and applied linguistics at the University of Hildesheim in Germany. And my research mainly focuses nowadays on early bilingualism and early bilingual education. And I first got in touch with EU English as such at the beginning of my career when I worked for the EIB in Luxembourg for a couple of years. And as I started working there, I realized that the language of EU institutions and EU documents is really different in many, many ways from just general English. So even if you go in there with a very high level of English and you know all the confidence that your English is really good, you'll still be surprised in many different ways. And I realized that this is really a special variety, a special register of the English language, just like legal English or academic English or business English, or any other register that's technical and specialized in many ways. So, like I said, we're going to, I don't see the materials appear, to be honest, so I don't
Yeah,
see the PowerPoint.
Ne haragudjatok, itt én most figyelem, és egyelőre pörög, valami miatt nem tudja megnyitni, úgyhogy most próbálok valamit tenni.
Okay, so,
elnézést kérek.
All right.
De
so,
nagyon remélem.
One of the questions that people often ask us is what EU English is, and this is basically, like I said, the language, this specialized register of the specialized variety of the English language that we hear when we go to EU institutions. And today I'm going to focus more on spoken English and differences between spoken general English and spoken EU English, as opposed to the written variety that we focused on the weeks before. But it's definitely a native speaker variety in the sense that all the EU documents that we have access to and that we're reading, and even very often the working documents of individual institutions that are not published for the general public, but just internally used within the institutions, even those documents are edited and revised by native speakers most of the time. So it's, but anything that gets published is always edited and revised by native speakers. So this is a native speaker variety, but of course, when we talk about spoken English, you'll see that it's there's a special twist because there are so many different people working in EU institutions together who use different languages and who are multilingual in general. So that adds a little bit of a twist to the language use. So we also like to point out that if you're interested in EU English, then you can, there are several resources to study this variety. You can simply just go ahead and download different publications. In the presentation, I showed you a number of, I can see the presentation. This is great. Can I start scrolling? Yes. Great. So I just talked about how this first slide that you can see, that this is a special variety of the English language, like I said. And yeah, this is where I am right now. So but there are a lot of different text types that you can actually have access to many of these different documents types are accessible on the internet or are published, and you can just simply go ahead and start reading a lot of these texts if you have to for your work, or if you're interested in the EU in more detail. And by processing these texts and reading them a lot, you will basically get used to many of the features that we then collect and point out to you, and make it easier for you to obviously to process this information in EU English courses. But you can already start doing that and familiarize yourself with different text types. Now, the EU English course materials, they are always based on a big collection of EU texts. I will show you examples of this. This is taken from one of the material bundles that we have. So this is a sample activity that you can take a look at. I'm sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so sometimes I cannot really, I hope you can hear me very well. So you also might take a look at the course books that we co-authored with Marti, and this is also very useful in the sense that all of the texts and all of the activities that are there are also based on big collections of EU documents. So you get acquainted with this special variety of the English language. And these large collections of texts that I mentioned that are called corpora, these collections of texts really help you and helped us when we were writing the book and the materials, when we put them together, to make sure that when we give you examples and when we show you how something, how a particular expression or how a particular term is used in EU documents, that we really base it on what's the reality and not just on how we feel, because we both worked with EU institutions, we both had experience there, and so we developed a kind of understanding. So we have a hunch, we have an intuition about whether or not something occurs very often in EU texts, but we could be wrong. And when you use these large collections of texts and analyze them using computer programs, then you get the reality, then you get examples of how this really occurs in these specialized texts, and not just what your hunch would be about them, what your feeling would be about them. And the reason why this works is this is just a little bit of background to how we learn and what is happening in our brain when we learn languages. The reason why these large collections of texts are so helpful is because this is exactly what we're doing in real life. We don't realize that this is what we're doing. It's a subconscious process. But when we learn new phrases and new expressions, then our brain takes statistics, and that's why the more often you hear a word or an expression, the more familiar it sounds, and the more you develop a kind of feel for the language, and you have the feeling that this sounds correct or this doesn't sound correct. And this is because your brain also takes statistics, just like a computer program would use a large collection of text and take statistics of the different words and expressions. And another interesting finding in neuroscience, which is a very recent finding actually, explains why it's so useful to learn expressions, so these chunks of words together rather than single words, why it's so useful for us. And the reason is because words, I don't know if you can see this on this illustration here, but you can go to the website and check out 3D images of the brain as somebody's reading a text. And the way we process information and the way we store the meaning of words in our brain is that we basically use a lot of different connections, like a web of connections. So words are always stored in a way that they are connected to other words and other expressions, and they are different. They are also connected to different areas of the brain, depending on what information these words are connected to. So this explains partly why it's so important not to learn individual words and word lists. And Marti will tell you about terminology and different specific EU terms. And this actually helps explain why we don't give you simply word lists to learn. Like, okay, this is the English expression, or this is the English term for a particular concept, and here's the Hungarian term. But we also try to develop an understanding and expand your understanding of the actual reality and the concepts behind these terms, because it will be processed similarly in your brain, and it will just simply help a natural process. So the way we are trying to do this is to support natural learning processes rather than go against them. Okay, now this is the question, the cue for me to start zooming in on particular examples. So the question is, why should you learn EU English if you already speak and write English at a higher proficiency level, for example, B2 or above? Well, this is really because the language of EU institutions and documents is different from general English. Close to half of the words of the vocabulary of EU documents is not among the 3,000 most frequent words of the British National Corpus. This really means the 3,000 most frequent words are the ones that we use most often at this level, at a B1, B2 level. So this really means that the vocabulary is highly specific. Of course, if you speak, if you're a lawyer, for example, if you work with legal documents on a regular basis, then you might have met a lot of this vocabulary, but some of them might receive a different meaning depending on which variety of English you're using, whether you're using British English or American English, or whether you're referring to the reality of the European Union. So now I'd like to show you a couple of examples taken from spoken English. And so far in the first two webinars, we always focused on written examples. So we took a text and we highlighted some key differences between general and EU English. And now I'd like to focus on spoken English a little bit, because that's also strikingly different in an EU institution than in just a regular office. So the first one is actually quite similar to what we observe in written language, that in EU English we use a lot of abbreviations, also not only in written English, but also in spoken English. So if you run through these sentences, you'll see that there are quite a few abbreviations in them. The question is here, I highlighted them again. The question is, do you know what's behind these abbreviations? If you work with someone from an EU institution, they will constantly, throw these abbreviations around. So you need to develop an understanding of what they are and what's behind them. And this is also something that Marta will mention in the terminology part. So for example, the EIB would refer to the European Investment Bank. The ECB would be the European Central Bank. Okay, DG is always Directorate General. EPSO is the Personnel Selection Office. So this is like the first site that we come into contact with if we're looking for a job at an EU institution. Okay. Now, what makes it a little bit even more interesting is that some of these abbreviations, we saw this last sentence previously. I just didn't want to stop and spend time on it, but you might have noticed this SCIC, this abbreviation here, which is an example of French in EU English. Now, French used to be the major, and it still is, and in spoken language, actually, it still is the most important language of communication within EU institutions. It's still the case that it's really difficult for someone who doesn't speak any French to work in an EU within an institution where the work, even though the working languages may be, you know, English or French or German or a combination of these three languages, but still you would need to speak some French, and if you don't, then you would need to learn some French because it's really prevalent. So you don't really, it's hard to get by without knowing any French. But even if you don't, some of these abbreviations you'll see that, and some of these expressions are in French, from more complex ones as SCIC, so the translation and interpretation service, which retained its French name, and that's why it's abbreviated this way. And then some simply just words like the concours or the stage. So they are referred to in French, and nobody really translates them into English when they just talk to somebody else. Right down to some very simple everyday words like a petit lait russe, which is basically a milk coffee, but everybody just calls it by the French name. So this is very typical. Now, this already gave you a hint. I mean, these sentences here, the English-French versions, they show you that there's a lot of code switching happening in EU institutions, and the reason for that really is that almost all the people who are there, I mean, everybody basically are multilingual, at least bilingual, but usually they speak more than two languages, and so they are very used to this. People who are bilingual, multilingual, you might know this from your own experience. If you grew up as a bilingual, but also if you sort of grow into this in the workplace, then you just get used to code switching. Code switching is when you switch from one language to the other, sometimes in the middle of the sentence, sometimes for just to say one word or one expression, but sometimes to say half the sentence in one language and half the sentence in another. And I have to say that I've never experienced so much code switching in my life as I did when I worked for the EIB. And it mainly happened in English and French because the two working languages of the EIB are English and French. But of course, there were a lot of people who spoke German, and so they code switched in all of these languages that they spoke. So here are just a couple of examples of how what this looks like in practice. And at the time when I worked in Luxembourg, I didn't speak a word of German. So for me, it was very it was not very comfortable when people code switched in English and German and French, but they just assumed that most people speak German as well, because in Luxembourg, German is also an official language. So you can see how this happens in real life, and that's why there's also an opportunity if you work for an EU institution to go to attend language courses in the major working languages that you don't fully master when you are hired. But this is something you just tend to get used to. Now, another interesting aspect of spoken English in EU institutions is something that you can also, that's not typical for EU institutions, but because there are so many different cultures and so many different countries represented in EU institutions, you get this sort of a compact version of intercultural differences. And I called this intercultural differences in habitual conversation patterns because many of the things that we say throughout the day, you may, it's easy to realize this when we just think about saying hello, saying goodbye, just talking about the weather. These are really habits. It's not really, when you start using the language, you realize that you say the same thing over and over again to different people, but you might have different habits depending on where you come from. And this is how are you is a classic example of this. And this is a typical example of differences between, for example, Hungarians and Americans, but this is also true of British people in my experience, that how are you is not a question about your well-being. It's simply another way to say hello. So when someone says, hi, how are you? And you say, hi, how are you? And then you both part ways and mind your own business, and nobody's really waiting for the other person to say anything in response to this question, then if you're not prepared for this, then you might have the feeling that people are unfriendly, that they're not really interested in whatever you have to say. And this is a very typical example, but there are also other more subtle examples that are that may not be as easy to spot as this one. But the reason why it's important to be aware of these is because these routines or habits, you use them automatically. You don't really think about them, but they still make an impression on you. And if you have the impression that somebody's not paying attention to you, to what you're going to say, then it leaves you feeling uneasy or hurt. So these differences are really important to spend time on and focus on in classes. So we really spend a lot of time on these in EU English courses. Okay, so this is just a couple of questions, just sort of quick brain teasers, like how do you address an older lady, for example, who you don't know and have not met before? Would you say lady, Mrs., Ms., ma'am, Miss, young lady? What would you say? And these, of course, can be highly culture specific. You don't do this in the same way in your first language necessarily as you do in a different language. Or how do you start a conversation with a professor, with a well-known professor after she gave an interesting talk? What would you call the person? So you could maybe think about these questions. If you're not sure, then we can get back to this after the lecture. And very closely linked to this is knowing what to say when to whom. So basically diplomatic language. How do you adjust what you're going to say depending on who you're talking to, depending on whether you're talking to someone who's a colleague of yours or maybe a friend of yours, or whether that person is your boss or is significantly older than you are. So you're going to change the way you communicate, and also the context, the situation in which you're communicating, that will also influence how you're going to formulate your thoughts. And so this is another aspect that we spend time on. This obviously has grammatical implications. It's usually more complicated to speak in a formal way than to say something in informal English to some of your friends. So this is something that we tend to also spend time on to make sure that that you're prepared for all kinds of situations. And also some of these situations are head scratchers, not just because they are in English, but simply because they are tricky situations. You would think about what to say in certain situations, even in your first language. So when it's about a language that you may not speak as well, then of course it's a different story, it makes it more difficult. So these are just a couple of examples of what we do and how we can approach this issue. Okay, so now I'm going to give the floor to Márta, who's going to tell you more about EU terms. And I think that the French will also come up in her presentation.
Yes, for sure. So yes, for sure. Thank you, Anna. So let me just say some words also about myself. Currently, I teach at the university, Budapest University of Technology and Economics here in Budapest in the Language Center. And I mainly teach in the translator training program, EU courses, terminology courses, translation courses. Originally, I am an economist and I also studied law, so linguistics was not really my field of research or my field of interest, but working several years in the Ministry of Education and dealing mainly with EU affairs and international affairs, just took me to this area, and I also opted for this research area. You can also see in my short presentation, you can also see some of the research examples. So the main findings I found there in my research work. So the question is, whether what Anna described about EU English is everything we have to know about EU English, and the answer is simply no, because EU English is made up not only the lexical textual features Anna talked about, but also a specific layer in every official EU language, which is called EU terminology. And by EU terminology, we mean the terms that describe EU concepts. For a while, it was not really sure whether we can at all speak about EU concepts, because you can simply say that the EU is made up of member states. Each member state has its own conceptual system, but since the EU is a mixture of an international, intergovernmental organization, and also has some supranational elements with its own legislation, which is obligatory in the member states, therefore you clearly have EU concepts, so concepts that only relate to the European Union and to the institutions of the European Union. And these terms are described in 24 languages, in the official languages of the European Union. And turning to the Hungarian EU terminology, what you need to know is that our Hungarian terminology is created by translation, which means that the whole conceptual thinking is carried out not in Hungarian but in English, in Brussels, in Luxembourg, and in the EU context in general. And this has a huge impact on our language, since if you imagine that experts, EU experts, are talking about a specific EU topic, and they invent something, they come up with a new idea or with a new concept, this is never made in Hungarian. So the first terms popping up in this context, such as flexicurity, inclusive growth, and all these EU terms which may sound weird now for your ears, they are all in English. Sometimes in French, as Anna also referred to this fact, but mainly in English. And then in the working groups, where also Hungarian experts are participating and interpretation is provided, then these terms, start to filter into our language. And then when they come into texts, then our translators has the task to translate them, and they become established Hungarian terms. But this is really a long process with many participants, also involving Hungarian participants, also involving participants working in the EU institutions. And these terms, also because of this fact, are sometimes very difficult to recognize, and I will show you a number of examples on that. In the presentations before, so previously, last week I showed you this picture, but sorry, for showing it again, because I think it shows very well the volume of these translations. This was an exhibition I participated many years ago in Brussels, and what you see here is basically a book, and this book contains all of the EU legal acts that had to be translated before Hungary had joined the European Union, and you could actually turn the pages in this huge several meter long book, and here this was shown because before and after accession, the translation process is very different. Before the country joins the European Union, the terminology and translation activities are carried out in the country. So the member state, the future member state, is responsible for this activity. But once the country has joined the European Union, all these activities are moved to Brussels and Luxembourg, which means that even if our Hungarian translators and terminologists work there, they are cut off from the national context, and they cannot just run out, and consult librarians or consult experts in an easy way, but they are far away from us, and this makes cooperation an important issue even today. After several years, Hungary joined the European Union, so there must be a constant cooperation between translators and experts. And I'm just telling you this because if you are one of those experts sitting in a ministry, for example, or in a company which receives EU texts continuously, then be aware of this fact that translators need your help because they may not know everything. So if a specific field is being regulated at EU level, then experts know the answers, experts know the equivalents to the English terms. And now let us turn just to some examples to show you why it's difficult to recognize EU terms. Here you can see two English examples taken from EU texts, and if you just look at them and try to translate these very simple sentences, then you may also get a hint because something is marked with red. So why it's difficult, and so here you see that the sentence itself is not so difficult to translate, but the difficulty lies in the fact that the two terms marked with red are not general words, they are EU terms. And the Hungarian equivalents of these terms are different from the equivalents you may be used to. Regulation, in the first case, refers to a specific legal act in the European Union, and in the second sentence, decision also refers to another legal act at EU level. So even if you may think that regulation may be just a general regulation in this sentence, or a decision, just a general decision, it's not true at all. So regulation and decision here in these two examples refer to specific EU legal acts with specific Hungarian equivalents. And if you do not have this background knowledge, if you do not know that there are EU legal acts, then it may be very difficult to recognize in this text that these are EU terms. This is a list of other EU terms which may be very familiar if you take them as general words. And let me just connect, to what Anna said. For a B2 language learner, these words, these expressions are not difficult at all. So I am sure that everyone would know what green paper, what VAT, what law, what a self-employed person means in a general context. But the problem is that in the EU context, you may not use these Hungarian equivalents. Of course, you may use them if they refer to this general meaning, but in most of the cases, if you come across them in an EU text, then they refer to EU concepts. And in this case, you have to use a different equivalent in each case. So for communication, közlemény, because it's a specific document issued by the European Commission. We discussed regulation and decision already. Green paper is not just a paper, the color of which is green, but it is also an important legal document of the European Commission. It usually launches a long consultation process with the public if a new legal act has to be introduced. VAT, I will come back to that later, to the explanation, but it's not áfa, but hozzáadott értékadó in the Hungarian EU context. And a self-employed person is a similar one, because egyéni vállalkozó is, of course, the equivalent we may know from the Hungarian context, but if this term refers to an EU concept, then it's a broader concept, which may include egyéni vállalkozó, but then in this case you have to use önálló vállalkozó, which is a broader term. And law is one of the most difficult terms because this is my experience in every course that participants think that, of course, it's törvény. We learned it in the beginning of our English studies, but in the EU context, you do not have any legal act which would bear this Hungarian name. So, in other words, in the EU, you do not have törvény. In English, you may say law, but every legal act has its specific name. So decision, regulation, recommendation, opinion, and directive. So if you see the term law, you may only use jog or jogszabály, and then it refers generally to the body of EU law or to the specific legal act, but without their names. And as Anna said, the EU English is really peppered with French terms, and you may easily say that this is just Euro jargon and this is just Eurospeak. And if you go to official documents, then French terms suddenly disappear. But this is not true at all. So one part of French terms are really related just to Euro jargon and to spoken EU English. But a number of terms are officially, a number of French terms are officially used in English, Hungarian, and all the other languages. And here are just some examples. One of the most typical ones is akik, which refers to the body of EU law. So all of the EU legal acts that had been adopted throughout the history of the EU. And even in Hungarian documents, you may come across this French term, and this is generally accepted. So this is not Eurojargon, this is accepted. You may use, of course, this beautiful Hungarian equivalent here, but if you work in an EU context, then you can be sure to find this term somewhere. Anna already mentioned concours, stagiaire. This is really Eurojargon. So no official document would mention this, because for concours you have open competition as the official English equivalent, or stage, stagiaire, you have trainee, traineeship as the official equivalents. But this is different. Sorry, I have to come back. This is different with the abbreviations. As you see here, Olaf and Coreper, the origin of these two abbreviations are French, and even if in each official language you have the equivalent, the abbreviation is French in all of the 24 official languages. So this is very funny also sometimes. There's also skik. I think in one of Anna's slides you could see skik, so which is the DG interpretation, so the Directorate General responsible for the interpretation services at EU level. But skik is widely used even in the website of this unit of the EU institutions. And yes, and Another interesting list I picked here is the accession process. What I highlighted here are two terms, accession country and acceding country, and you may think that these two terms are just synonyms, because what may be the difference between accession and acceding? These may basically mean the same, but this shows the importance of terminology and why it's necessary to deal with terminology at this level, because here these two expressions refer to two completely different processes and to two different stages of the accession process. So you can see here in the explanation. So it really makes a difference if you use accession country or acceding country in a text. And also, you have to have an understanding of what these terms mean if you read a text, for example, as an EU expert, and of course it may have an impact on your negotiation process if you are involved with these issues. And all this I have discussed so far may result in weird terms, of course. So if people hear, főtanácsnok, héja, or even the term flexicurity in Hungarian text, so they may say, but what's that? This EU English is completely I just don't get it. So what do these words mean? But what you have to see here is that in these two first cases, for example, this was the deliberate choice of translators and EU terminologists to have a weird name for these EU concepts. Originally, Advocate General was translated as főügyész in Hungarian. So when at the time when Hungary joined the European Union, but Advocate Generals are not at all főügyész. Advocate Generals work for the Court of the European Union, and they have an advising role. They issue opinions, so they do not prosecute. They do not have the role you would attach to Advocate General working in a national context. So at that time, translators and also Hungarian experts realized that if we use the word főügyész, then it would lead to complete misunderstandings, and therefore they opted for a term, főtanácsnok, which meant something 30 years ago or 40 years ago, but now didn't have any concept attached to it, and they said, okay, let's take this term, főtanácsnok, and let's say that from now on, this term describe the EU Advocate General. The same happened to VAT, which may refer to both the national VAT and the VAT regulated at EU level. And since our Hungarian translators felt that this would be confusing to use AFA for both concepts, therefore they gave a literal translation, a word-by-word translation for VAT, héja, that's hozzáadott értékadó, and this became then the EU, the Hungarian EU term for this EU concept. It's sometimes very funny in my EU courses when I first show my students this term. So some of my students, tell me that why cannot why cannot our Hungarian translators translate it properly? So do they not know that the equivalent of VAT is AFA? So they are really shocked in the beginning, and they think that this is a mistranslation. But this is not a mistranslation at all. This is this was was the intention of the EU translators to translate it like that. And finally, an example, flexicurity, which is a word game, flexible and security. And even if there is a Hungarian official translation for that, rugalmas biztonság, which refers to the labor market, so how the labor market should look like for everybody. Flexicurity has been established to such an extent in Hungarian terminology that this term is already accepted. So this English term is accepted in Hungarian EU terminology, which means that you may even come across with this term in EU texts. And this is the proof of it. I am not sure whether you know this database or whether you have ever used it, but you may find a number of glossaries available in the internet. But if you really want to get the official EU terminology, then use only this website. The abbreviation for IATE, so the abbreviation stands for Interactive Terminology for Europe. This database is being uploaded by our Hungarian translators and by all translators, of course, in the 24 official languages of the EU. And it may be now a bit, if you know the database, then you may have realized that the display has been changed on the 12th of November, so exactly 1 week ago, and it really looks different now. However, the signs, and all these, small descriptions remained the same, which means that if you see 4 or 3 stars next to the terms, it means that these terms are reliable. So you can really think that what you find here is the equivalent of the original term, and here is the proof. So for flexicurity, you find both rugalmas biztonság and flexicurity, and you see here now in very small letters, I hope you can read it, that it's admitted. So even in Hungarian EU terminology, this English term is admitted. And of course, this shows the an example of the impact of the English language, but be also aware of the fact that this is not, the responsibility of translators. This is mainly because of our EU experts, because once they start discussing a topic and once they start using English terms in their Hungarian discussions, then this English term starts being established also in Hungarian terminology. And even if EU translators then try to give a proper Hungarian equivalent for the English term, they usually fail because experts already use the English term. Okay. And now some background EU knowledge we think is important for learning these EU terms. Of course, as Anna already mentioned, there may be ways, to learn EU terms where you only get a list of EU terms and you just learn them. But a better way is to really understand what's behind these terms. And here is just one key point of departure, so what we do in our courses. In order to understand the functioning of the European Union, we use terms at national level. And one important concept at national level is the separation of powers. You may remember that even from your historical studies. So the judicial, executive and legislative power. And if you also think further and focus on the legislative power, then you may also mention some countries where the legislative power is made up not of one chamber, but of 2 chambers. And an example is provided, of course, by Germany with Bundestag, Bundesrat, by the US with the House of Representatives and by the Senate. And here the key point is that while the Bundestag represents and the House of Representatives represents all the people in Germany and in the US, Bundestag Bundesrat and Senate represents the states and the Länder. And if you go to the EU context, then this gives you an idea of how the EU is functioning, because the EU is also made up of member states in the same way, basically, as the US is made up of states and Germany is made up of Länder. And here is now a picture which may help. What you see here are the main institutions of the EU: the European Commission, the Council of the EU, and the European Parliament. And if we focus again on the legislative power, and as you see here, we call them co-legislators. In the EU, you have two branches in this legislative power: the Council of the EU and the European Parliament. And now if you think again what the relation between Bundestag, Bundesrat was, and what the relationship between House of Representatives and the Senate was, then you may draw a parallel to the EU context and say that the Council of the EU acts basically as the upper chamber, like the Bundesrat or the Senate, and the European Parliament acts as the lower chamber, or the Bundestag, or the House of Representatives. My experience is that this is one of the the most difficult points. People, even EU experts, do not understand what the role of the two institutions are. And if you already know this, then it's for you easier to differentiate between the European Council and the Council of the EU. So the two councils at EU level. As you see with the flags, the Council of the EU is made up by the member state ministers, so that's the minister level, and the European Council is made up of the heads of state and government. So if you hear EU summit and you see the red carpet, journalists, media, and so on, then you can be sure that this summit was a European Council meeting. You hear much less about the Council of the EU. And then some hints for how to learn EU terminology. I showed you this picture in the previous seminar, and now I deliberately didn't write the institution's name for that, because of course here the question is who is sitting in this Brussels boat. So which institutions are described by these persons sitting in the boat, and the solution is of course that, and it shows very well the role of these institutions. So European Council just showing the direction, because that's the highest level, the heads of state and government level. The Commission is said to be the motor of integration, so that's the person paddling. And the Council and the Parliament are co-legislators, as we have just discussed, and they are sitting hand in hand. And mind mapping is one of our, main method tools, because we really think that EU terms are not just a list of terms, so it's better to make whole term families, and we do a lot in our courses of this, so that you have to attach more and more terms and how they relate to each other. And the same is done with pictures. So if you so here you have to tell which meetings, what institutions they are related to, all these persons. First, of course, you have to recognize the person and remember their names, because these are basically the EU personalities. And then you also have to say what are the institutions they go to, and in this way it's better to remember them. And if you put together all this, then what you get in the end is really a huge mind mapping activity where you have key terms related to specific institutions, to specific key EU areas. You can also connect persons. You can even connect buildings for that. So if you hear Berlaymont, for example, then you know in the EU context that it refers to the European Commission. If you hear Justus Lipsius, then you know that that's the European Council or the Council of the EU's building. So this is so to say, the final result of our EU courses as well. And if you put together now also these two presentations, so everything what Anna said, and now this final table, so basically the texts and spoken English and EU terminology, then you get this EU context we discussed in this presentation. Yeah, thank you very much. And just one last remark that these pictures, because I forgot to say, this is taken from the publication Emőke mentioned you, so what you can reach on the Somogy megyei kereskedelmi és iparkamara website. In this publication, I try to produce similar pictures describing this EU concept. Thank you very much.
Nagyon szépen köszönjük. Köszönjük Márti, köszönjük Anna, nagyon érdekes volt. Én őszintén remélem, hogy mindenki élvezte és végighallotta. Egyetlen egyszer volt talán, hogy Annának egy fél mondatát nem hallottam jól, de én őszintén remélem nem jöttek itt közben jelzések, hogy bárkinek nem volt jó a vétel. Úgyhogy nagyon szépen köszönjük a részvételt, és mindenképpen fogunk küldeni nektek, vagy önöknek ilyen visszajelző kérdőívet, és nagyon kíváncsian várjuk a visszajelzéseiket ezzel kapcsolatban, hogy mi volt az, amit tanultak a mai napon, volt-e valami hiányérzetük, illetve hogy szívesen dolgoznának-e továbbra is velünk, vagy érdekelni önöket a további. Igen, érdekelni önöket, hogy mit és hogyan lehet tovább ezeket tanulni, igen. Nem tudom, hogy Márti, Anna, nektek van-e még?
Esetleg, hogyha van most bármi prompt kérdés, akkor szívesen válaszolunk, mert ugye nagyon tartottuk az időt.
Igen, ezt szeretném megköszönni, hogy ügyesek voltatok. Akár be is lehet kapcsolni fönt a mikrofont, és úgy is lehet kérdezni, vagy itt lent a jobb oldali type your message kicsi dobozba. És a szlájdok
ugye pörögtek, tehát mentek rendesen, mert én a Mártiét láttam jól, tehát ahogy váltogattam. Most
igen, én láttam.
Jól van akkor.
Igen, úgy tűnik, hogy itt az utolsóra a szlájdokat megkapjuk, kapunk egy ilyen kérdést.
Hát erről nem beszéltünk még, ugye, mert ugye ezt föl is vettétek most, ezzel nem tudom, mi a terv Emőkkel, mert ezzel volt valami terv, igen. Nem? Hogy a...
Hát mindenképpen szeretnénk a honlapra legalábbis egy részét kirakni, hogy egy kicsi ilyen ízelítő, hogy milyen is a képzés. Úgyhogy lehet, hogy így a teljes anyagot nem, de a honlapunkat szerintem mindenképpen figyeljétek, és akkor ott bizonyos részeit elérhetővé fogjuk tenni. Inkább jövőre, tehát most nem decemberre mondanám, hanem igen. A következő kérdés, hogy lesz-e képzés tavasszal? Hát ez a tervünk, nagyon szeretnénk, de az a helyzet, hogy minimum egy 12 főnek össze kell gyűlnie ahhoz, hogy tudjunk képzést tartani. Tehát azért is tartottuk most ezeket az ingyenes webináriumokat, egy kicsit ilyen kedvcsinálónak, hogy akik esetleg részt vettek és szeretnének eljönni, akkor legyen lehetőségük, és figyeljenek minket, kérdezzenek, illetve ha lehetőség van, akkor összeszedjünk ennyi embert, illetve hogyha van egy cég részéről, vagy egy intézmény részéről érdeklődés, akkor ilyen csoportos képzéseket azt mindenképpen szoktunk tartani, tehát lehet akkor ilyen árajánlatot kérni, és akkor azt az adott intézmény kérésének megfelelően tudjuk szabni, időpontilag is, meg helyszínileg is, meg tartalmilag is.
Még én annyit hozzátennék, hogy mi Mártival ezt már tervbe vettük, hogy az EU-English könyvet, ami ugye egy ilyen lényegében egy tehát egy nyelvkönyvszerű, tehát olyasmi, mint egy business angol könyv, aki volt a képzésen, az már ugye látta részeit adott esetben, de lényegében egy elég vaskos nyelvkönyv. Ennek mi tervezzük, hogy egy ilyen felújítottabb változatát elkészítjük, ugye újabb szövegekkel, meg ilyesmi, bár a szövegeknek egy része az ugye nem változik olyan szempontból, hogy ezek azért sokszor olyan szövegrészleteket tettünk bele, amik hát nem változó, frissülő szövegek, hanem hát meglévő kiadványok, de mindenképpen tervezzük ennek egy felújított változatát idővel, úgyhogy ez azért úgy várható lesz a közeljövőben. Akár olyan módon, hogy fejezetenként elérhető legyen, vagy ilyesmi, tehát még így megpróbálunk rugalmasabbak lenni azon a téren, hogy adott esetben nem csak egy komplett kurzuskönyvet kelljen megvenni, vagy használni, hanem lehet kombinálni a különböző részeket.
Igen. Szerint. De az, igen, és talán még egy kiegészítés, hogy a képzésnél ugye pontosan erre szoktunk ugye a közalapítvánnyal is törekedni, hogy azért is hívtuk fel a figyelmet most ennyiféle honlapra, hogy elég tág tárházát adjuk ezeknek a különböző anyagoknak, mert ugye mindenkinek más valamire kell ez az EU kontextus. Tehát van, akinél inkább az EU tartalom az, ami fontosabb, mert mondjuk EU tisztviselőként dolgozik valahol, őnekik mondjuk például ez, amit ugye most például nyitva van itt ez a slide, ugye nekik inkább egy ilyen jellegű anyag, ami az EU tartalmat magyarázza, jó, akkor az az EU English könyv, amiről most Anna is beszélt, ugye ez pedig kifejezetten egy nyelvkönyv, tehát a nyelvi részt fejleszti. Tehát ugye, hogyha most itt kérdeztétek a szlájdokat, akkor igazából ezeken a kurzusokon tulajdonképpen ezeken megyünk végig szisztematikusan, mindig hozzátéve vagy hivatkozva azokra az anyagokra, amelyekről itt most beszélünk, meg ezeket megemlítettük.
Igen, és aztán még egy dolog jutott nekem eszembe, hogy a képzés kapcsán próbálom gondolkodni azon, hogy hogyan lehetne egy olyan típusú blended képzést összerakni, ugye, ami kevesebb kontaktóra és több online része, hogy ne kelljen feltétlenül olyan hosszú időt ugye a munkahelyről eljönni, tehát hogy ez a fajta gondolkodás is elkezdődött, tehát mindenképpen szeretnénk az igényeknek megfelelően esetleg egy ilyen irányba is elmozdulni. Jó, van-e esetleg még kérdés?
Igen, mi is köszönjük.
Jó, hát akkor én szeretném megköszönni a résztvevőknek is, igen, meg az oktatóknak is, és akkor most lezárom a webináriumot, és mindenkinek további szép estét kívánunk. Szervusztok!